So Formula 1 in the United States is in a very good place right now. I think it's fair to say there's currently 3 Grand Prix that take place in the country. The US GP at COTA and also the Miami and Las Vegas Grand Prix in, well, Miami and Las Vegas. You know, that has reached the same level that it's ever been at back in the 1980s when there also used to be 3 races in some years as well. Things are very much going well. The audience in America is growing massively. Things like Drive to Survive have really boosted the popularity of the pinnacle of motorsport in the USA immeasurably over the last, well, pretty much a decade or so. But things have not always been as rosy when it comes to Formula 1 in the United States. Almost 20 years ago, we had an incident that nearly destroyed Formula 1 as a whole, and it certainly did eventually destroy Formula 1 in the United States. There were no United States Grand Prix, nor any Grand Prix of any description that took place in a Formula 1 category. That is obviously things like IndyCar still run Grand Prix. A Grand Prix is basically the grand prize. But I'm talking about Formula 1 Grand Prix. There wasn't a single one between 2008 and 2011, and then obviously 2012 we had COTA built, and it's been on the calendar ever since. But what happened in 2005? Well, if you've seen my similar video, which I did about the Crashgate scandal, that was off the back of a lot of incidents such as Spygate and Tyregate. Tyregate is what happened at the 2005 United States Grand Prix, and it's something that you will not hear about in the build-up to the USGP this weekend. This is very much taboo in the Formula 1 world. You don't talk about this on official channels. It never happened, and in truth, I can see why. I get it. I get why they don't want to shout about it, but that's why you come to people like me. You come to the F1 Chronicle for the real story. This is what actually happened. This is what really happened in 2005. So basically, the weekend began like any other, but during practice, Ralf Schumacher, who was driving for Toyota at the time, had a very bad crash at turn 13 of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Back then, Formula 1 used to compete at the Indy Road Course, which I believe now both NASCAR has competed around that track, and also IndyCar still does compete around that track. Indeed, even MotoGP has, but I'm digressing here. Basically, the final corner of the track is what is the first corner of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and it's just ran backwards. It's a very high speed, very high banked corner, and the Michelin tyres that Toyota were running at the time were not up to the task. Basically, the pressure and the load on those tyres was too much, plus the diamond cut surface, which is basically how the track is created too much of a problem for the tyres, and it basically just failed. Simple as that. Schumacher had a really bad crash with that, and he sat out the rest of the weekend as a result. Ricardo Zonta, Toyota's test driver, took his place. Now, it's not new to have a crash there, but the investigation basically said that their tyres were not up to spec. They were not good enough to run around this track. And something else you have to understand about Formula 1 during this time, this was before the days of Pirelli being the sole tyre provider for the series. Indeed, there were 2 of them, Michelin, who had the majority of the grid, and Bridgestone, who had only Ferrari, Jordan and Minardi. So with that, effectively, most of the competitors were deemed unable to carry out a Grand Prix distance. Now, the debates between the teams for what to do was very much rampant. On the one side, you had Bridgestone, mainly led by Ferrari, who was saying, well, Michelin, you've produced a tyre that is not good enough for this race. Therefore, you cannot compete here. It's not our fault that you couldn't do your job properly. On the other hand, you had Michelin and probably most of the grid at that point, obviously the likes of Renault, McLaren, all the drivers that were going for the championship this year. Because you've got to remember as well, this championship was between Kimi Raikkonen and Fernando Alonso. Raikkonen driving for McLaren and Alonso driving for Renault. Ferrari were having an awful year. And again, just to go on to the tyres a little bit more, this was a very strange year in terms of the regulations, the only year where this actually happened. So what happened previously in prior years is that cars would refuel, because this was back in the days of refueling as well, and they would also change the tyres as well. The tyres were a lot harder than what we have now with the Pirellis. They didn't degrade as much, but they still degraded, obviously. And on top of that as well, you were allowed to change your tyres, like I said, in all the years before 2005. However, Formula 1 changed its regulations for 2005 to specifically combat the dominance of Ferrari. Ferrari had won every Constructors' Championship between 1999 and 2004, with Michael Schumacher picking up 5 drivers' titles between 2000 and 2004. There were a lot of calls from circles in Formula 1 saying, well, it's too predictable, Michael Schumacher just wins all the time, and he was an absolute running machine at the time. But basically the tyre regulations were changed for 2005, where it said, well, no, you cannot change your tyres unless there is an emergency, unless you have a puncture or something like that. I mean, think about doing an entire race on one set of tyres. It does not happen nowadays unless it's got a very extreme circumstance like Esteban Ocon at the 2021 Turkish Grand Prix when he did the whole race on intermediate tyres, but that's another story for another day. Just a bit of knowledge for you guys there. But basically that meant that the tyres were completely redesigned, and it really hurt the performance of Ferrari. Ferrari had not won a single race up until that point this year. I mean, they'd gone from winning them all to winning none, so it was a big decrease. Now, the cars qualified as normal. It was actually, I believe, the first pole for Toyota. Jarno Trulli started on pole, which might be his first ever pole, or his only pole in the time as well, because of that. But qualifying is one thing, racing is another. It was deemed that these tyres were safe for about 12-15 laps, but the race itself was about 70 laps, I believe. It was a relatively short circuit by F1 standards. 73 laps was the race distance. So a few compromises were offered. One of them was to change the race layout, because the effector corner was the only part of the track where this was dangerous, where they only went on a diamond cut surface at those bankings at those speeds. So basically the team said, well, why don't we put a chicane there? But this was rejected because it was said, well, then you're changing the race layout. We agreed on this layout, and you've also got things like licensing issues, because even back then Formula 1 Grand Prix had to be run at grade 1 circuits. This new layout where they've put these makeshift cones or a makeshift chicane would not technically have been a grade 1 circuit, so it was rejected on that. Another thing that was offered was the Michelin runners to pit every 15 laps, a mandated pit stop every 15 laps. And again, this isn't uncommon. We've seen this before. Was it Qatar last year? We saw it at a race last year where there was mandated pit stops, where it's like you can only run on these tyres for this distance. And Michelin offered to do that, but again, it was rejected mainly by Ferrari, because it was like, well, you know, that's not making much of a spectacle here. This is going to be a bit embarrassing. Which, of course, very, very famous last words and extremely ironic, given what eventually happened, of course. But that was one of the reasons, and I have to admit, it would have been a bit ridiculous. But in fairness, you would have still probably had, even with all those pit stops, you still would have probably had the Jordans and the Minardis at the back of the field, and with the likes of Ferrari, running away with the race, because their opponents would have to do 5 or 6 pit stops compared to their 1 or 2. But you still have a race, and everybody, and you have to realise as well, the Formula 1 was massive in the United States. There were hundreds of thousands of fans. If you've ever seen the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, I think it can hold like 300,000 people. It is an absolute cathedral of motorsport, and even though it wasn't completely full for F1, it was still a massive crowd by anybody's standards. So a lot of people have come not only from other parts of the United States, but also other parts of the world to view this race. The teams, and you can watch the build-up to this Grand Prix on YouTube, which I've done recently as well, and it's a fascinating thing where Martin Brundle's going around on the ITV coverage and speaking to people like Bernie Ecclestone, speaking to the drivers, being like, we don't know what's going to happen, we'll just have to wait and see. And what did end up happening was that because they couldn't come to an agreement, and it was deemed that the Michelin tyres were unsafe, and because they couldn't fly in new tyres fast enough from Europe as well, because they'd have to design, manufacture and transport all these tyres within less than 2 days. Get it from Europe over to Indiana, it's a long way. They couldn't do it. All the drivers went on the parade lap, they went to line up at the grid, and only 6 cars lined up at the start of the race. The other 14 all pulled into the pits. The McLarens, the Renaults, the Saubers, all of them. They all went into the pits. The Williamses, all the people that were competitive, apart from Ferrari. So you had 6 cars lining up on the start of the grid, and it was a farcical situation. You had the crowd booing, the crowd were throwing beer onto and other projectiles onto the circuit, which I don't condone, but I obviously understand their frustrations, because can you imagine spending hundreds of dollars on a race ticket? This might have been your first ever race, You know, you might have took your family there, be like, let's go see some F1, let's go see some Formula 1. You might have paid for hospitality tickets for all we know. And people were going out in their droves, they were vowing never to come back to the track. And because of that, you had a 1-2 with Ferrari, Michael Schumacher, Rubens Barrichello. Those guys actually almost collided as well while they were battling for the lead, which I found was funny. Yeah, Thiago Montero getting his first ever podium in Formula 1, his only podium, Jordan's last podium because they went out of business after this race, after this season. I believe the only ever podium for a Portuguese driver in Formula 1 too. I mean, he was thrilled. He was celebrating like no tomorrow. Schumacher and Barrichello, very muted celebrations. One of the darkest days in Formula 1 history where, unfortunately, the teams could not come to an agreement. And I have to say, all these years later, looking back at it, you gotta blame Ferrari. Ferrari were the ones saying no. I believe Jordan and Minardi were like, yeah, cool, we'll do that, no problem. It would actually help them, to be in fairness, let's be honest. But Ferrari said no, and they needed a unanimous vote. And of course, Ferrari have veto power in Formula 1. If they say no, it don't go. Simple as that. But unfortunately, this race did go ahead, and it was one of the darkest days in Formula 1 history. It ruined its relationship with the United States for years and years, and it's only truly recovered in the last few years or so, I would say, personally, in terms of its popularity. And this is an event that is very much swept under the rug. Don't talk about it. It's just taboo. But here on the F1 Chronicle, we are always here to bring you stuff like this. I'm always up to talk about stuff like this because it's a very dark day in F1 history. And, you know, we should talk about these events, and we should make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. And I don't think it will, because we've got a sole tyre supplier, so we're not going to get these tyre wars causing this. That was the biggest thing, the fact there were two different tyres, two different manufacturers, and they were battling each other. If it wasn't for that, if they all ran the same tyre, then, well, they would have made an exception and they would have made it work, because they wouldn't have a choice. But as it was, Ferrari ran Bridgestone, so Ferrari said no, we're not going to let you do it. And another knock-on effect was the fact that Bridgestone eventually became the dominant tyre supplier in Formula 1. Michelin, after this, slowly faded out of the sport. I think they left in 2008. I had something like that. So then Bridgestone became the sole supplier until 2010, and then Pirelli came in 2011. But yeah, bit of history for you guys there. I hope you enjoyed that. It's a very dark day in F1 history, like I said, but we should talk about it so that we should never repeat it again. That's my view on it. And what are your memories of Tyregate? Do you remember watching it live at the time? I do. I remember being in absolute disbelief. I had no idea how these guys couldn't come to an agreement. I was 11 years old at the time, so I didn't understand politics like I do now. No, sorry, I wasn't 11. I was 9. God. Yeah, so definitely didn't understand politics back then. But yeah, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, guys. We'll see you very soon for some more F1 history on the Formula1Chronicle.com. And let's hope the USGP this weekend is a lot better than 2005. I'm sure it will be. See you soon. Have a good one.